The Netherlands in the 16th century was a land of waterways, canals and rivers, where the struggle for control was as fierce as the tide itself. The land was soaked not only with water, but with rebellion, as Protestant reformers clashed with Catholic rulers. Punishments were designed not just to kill, but to terrify. Among the most feared of these punishments was the drowning cage, a device as cruel as it was symbolic. Iron cages, small enough to crush the body into stillness, were hung from wooden beams or stone bridges above the rivers. They swung like grim pendulums over the flowing currents, waiting for the tide to claim its victim. The condemned were stripped of their dignity and shoved into these cages with brutal efficiency. Once locked inside, they could neither stand nor lie comfortably. The body was forced into a twisted posture. At first, their feet dangled above the river, the water lapping close, mocking them with its slow rise. Citizens who dared defy authority, rebels, heretics, or outspoken dissenters, found themselves caged above the waterways that connected villages and towns. For passers-by, it was a chilling sight, the condemned staring out with hollow eyes, knowing their death would not come quickly, but with the crawl of the tide. The punishment carried a public warning. The cages were placed where trade boats passed, where merchants and fishermen could not ignore them. People watched as bodies were slowly taken by the water, a warning to all who might dare whisper defiance against king, church, or governor. At low tide, the prisoners endured long hours of exposure. Their skin burned from the sun by day and froze under the misty night air. Hunger clawed at their stomachs, thirst parched their mouths, but the cruelest torment was anticipation, knowing the water would rise again. As the tide came in, the water crept higher and higher. At first, ankles and calves were soaked, sending icy waves of pain through their stiff bodies. Soon the river lapped against their chests, then necks, until every breath required the desperate lifting of the chin. The drowning itself was rarely swift. Prisoners often resisted until the very last moment, lifting their heads, gasping for precious air. The current slapped against their faces, filling their mouths and lungs with bitter water. Their death was a drawn-out suffocation, half-breaths cut short by relentless waves. The symbolism of the punishment struck deeply in the Netherlands, a country whose identity was bound to water. Rivers brought wealth and survival, but here they became instruments of slow murder. To die beneath the rising tide was to be swallowed by the very force that sustained the nation. One of the most infamous uses of the drowning cages occurred during the suppression of the Anabaptists in the city of Münster and across Dutch towns. These radical reformers were declared heretics, and many were publicly caged, their deaths turned into a warning against challenging the religious order. Chroniclers describe crowds gathering on bridges, staring in silence as men and women awaited their fate. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, peeking at the victims with frightened curiosity. The condemned would sometimes pray loudly, their words carrying across the water, before the river silenced them forever. The cages themselves were crude but effective. Forged from heavy iron bars, they were narrow, barely wider than a man's shoulders. Prisoners were locked inside with no escape, and once the tide rose, the water became their executioner. The iron grew slippery with rust and algae, a prison swallowed by the river itself. Some victims died quickly from panic, inhaling water in their terror. Others clung to life with astonishing endurance, holding their breath and lifting their faces again and again until exhaustion overwhelmed them. Their final moments were a mixture of instinctive struggle and resigned surrender. What made the punishment even more terrifying was that the cages were not removed immediately after death. Bodies were often left hanging, bloated by the river, rotting slowly in the air. Passing boats would see them swaying gently, a grisly reminder of rebellion crushed. Authorities preferred this punishment because it required no executioner's hand at the final moment. The river itself was the executioner. In this way, rulers claimed their justice was natural, as inevitable as the tide, leaving no man or woman beyond its reach. Merchants traveling by boat often wrote of their unease at seeing such scenes. Letters described the haunting image of cages swinging in the mist, sometimes holding silent skeletons after weeks of exposure. The stench carried across the water, mingling with the salt air of the tides. The condemned were not always criminals in the true sense. Many were intellectuals, reformers, or townspeople accused of harboring rebellious sympathies. Their deaths were meant to send a message: silence your dissent, or the river will claim you too. Even in death, the cages spoke. Villagers whispered about the souls trapped above the waterline, restless and vengeful. Fishermen swore they heard cries carried on the fog, voices of the drowned demanding justice long after their bodies had sunk. The practice also revealed the cruelty of power in its purest form. By choosing water as the method, rulers exploited the natural fear of drowning, a primal terror shared by all. To watch another human fight, the rising tide was to see mortality in its rawest shape. As the 16th century dragged on, these cages became part of the cultural memory of oppression. Songs, ballads, and whispered tales carried the horror from one generation to the next. The sight of the river's prison remained etched in the Dutch mind, a symbol of power's ability to bend even nature into an ally of death. The cages were not only instruments of death, but also of spectacle. Executions drew crowds, but drownings in cages offered something longer. A slow theater of suffering stretched across hours, sometimes days. Every ripple of the tide became part of the executioner's hand. For the condemned, there was no bargaining with their fate. They could not plead with a hangman, nor brace for a single strike of the axe. Their execution lay in the hands of water, rising inch by inch, indifferent and unstoppable. The rivers of the Netherlands, once lifelines of commerce and survival, became arenas of despair. Every cage that swung from a bridge or beam testified to the iron grip of rulers who demanded obedience through fear, and every drowning was a performance staged for those who dared to look away. The tide always rose, the water always claimed its victim, and the cages, empty or filled with bones, continued to hang above the rivers, swaying gently as if mocking the living who dared to pass below. The drowning cages became tools not just of punishment, but of politics. They were employed during moments of upheaval, when rebellion threatened to spread through towns like fire in dry fields. Those who resisted taxation, church decrees, or royal edicts often found themselves locked above the rivers. In Amsterdam, Leiden, and Haarlem, cages were hung from bridges that connected the arteries of commerce. Ships laden with spices and timber sailed beneath, forced to pass under the shadow of swaying prisoners. The message was unmissable. The water carried wealth, but it could also carry death. Reports describe men locked inside for days, exposed to the cycle of tides. At low tide, they endured hunger, thirst, and humiliation. When the waters rose, they gasped for breath until the current silenced them. Some bodies remained slumped for weeks. Iron cages turned into macabre ornaments above the river. The cages had a cruel simplicity. They were designed to make nature itself the executioner. No sword struck, no rope tightened. Instead, the tide rose as predictably as the moon, leaving the condemned powerless. The steady rhythm of the river became a countdown no one could escape. Prisoners often prayed aloud, hoping their words would echo over the water. Some recited psalms, others cursed their captors with bitter rage. Their voices carried down the canals, mixing with the creak of ropes and the slap of waves. For those listening, it was a chorus of despair. Women too were not spared from this fate. In the crackdown on Anabaptist sects, several women accused of heresy were confined in cages, their deaths displayed before horrified crowds. Chroniclers note how their cries echoed across the water, silenced only when the tide finally claimed them. Children in boats peered up with wide eyes, watching the cages sway above them. Parents often urged them to look away, but curiosity was stronger than obedience. The sight of a body locked in iron, half submerged, left marks on their memory that could not be washed away. For townsfolk, the cages symbolized both fear and fascination. They whispered about the condemned even after the bodies were removed. Who had they been? What crime had brought them to such an end? The answers shifted with rumor, turning the executed into legends of sin or martyrdom. The river itself was transformed by the cages. Where once it carried trade and food, it now bore witness to punishment. The water that nourished crops and filled cisterns was the same water that filled the lungs of rebels, blending life and death in one flow. In times of high rebellion, cages multiplied across the waterways. Bridges that once echoed with the footsteps of merchants and farmers now bore the weight of prisoners above and corpses below. Each tide carried more victims, and each victim carried more fear into the hearts of the living. Authorities often timed the executions with the tides. Prisoners were locked in cages shortly before the water began to rise, ensuring the crowd could watch every stage of the drowning. The spectacle drew onlookers not only from the city, but from nearby villages eager and horrified. The cages created a theater of suffering, drawn out across hours. A man would lift his head above the waterline again and again, each time more desperate until his strength gave way. His final breath was always the same, a gasp swallowed by the river's current. Not all died quickly. Some survived through several tide cycles, clinging to life in misery. At dawn, they shivered from the cold. At noon, they baked under the sun. Their faces grew hollow, their lips cracked, and their eyes glazed. But still they endured until the water claimed them. The cruelty extended even beyond death. Bodies were often left in place to rot, their bones bleaching in the wind. Travelers spoke of skeletons swinging in cages, clattering against the iron as if the dead themselves protested their fate. The rivers became graveyards without graves. Merchants who passed by recorded their horror in journals. Some wrote that the sight of the cages ruined their meals, the stench of rot following them across the waterways. Others confessed that they grew numb, the cages becoming just another fixture of the river's edge. Priests sometimes visited the condemned, offering final prayers before the tide rose. Yet many victims rejected them, spitting at the idea of salvation from the same church that condemned them. Their faith, or lack of it, remained locked in the cage with them until their last moment. The punishment also served as a test of loyalty. Citizens were expected not only to witness, but to approve. To question the cages was to risk joining those inside them. Silence then became another form of submission, enforced by the swaying iron above the river. Rebellion was always near the surface in the Netherlands, and the cages were a reminder of what defiance cost. Yet, instead of extinguishing resistance, they often fueled it. Tales of martyrs spread, turning drowned rebels into symbols of courage whispered about in taverns and marketplaces. Even fishermen grew uneasy. They claimed their nets sometimes caught scraps of clothing or bone near the cages. Some swore the fish themselves tasted strange, as if the river carried the essence of death within it. Superstition wrapped itself around the waterways, staining them with fear. The cages also influenced art and balladry. Anonymous songs told of men and women who defied rulers and met their end above the rivers. These songs were forbidden, but they circulated in secret, giving voice to the suffering that rulers tried to silence with water. In quiet hours, when fog rolled in and the river ran dark, the cages looked like ghosts hanging above the water. Travelers crossing bridges in the night claimed to hear moans or rattling chains, though often it was only the wind and the current. Still, fear spread like mist. The authorities maintained the cages not just for justice, but for control. By placing them in the busiest waterways, they ensured no man or woman could forget who ruled. The water itself became a weapon, used to crush the will of a nation struggling for freedom. As the years went on, the drowning cages became synonymous with tyranny. They stood as reminders that the river, lifeblood of the Dutch people, could also be twisted into an instrument of terror. And while bodies vanished beneath the tide, the memory of their suffering lingered in every current. Each cage was both a prison and a tomb, suspended above the restless water. And with every rising tide, another voice was silenced, another story drowned, another warning carved into the conscience of the living. By the 17th century, the drowning cages had already carved their place into Dutch memory. Though less frequently used, their shadow still loomed over the rivers. Merchants, sailors, and peasants all knew the sight of iron swaying above the tide, even when no prisoner hung within. The punishment was gradually replaced by other executions, beheadings, hangings, or the wheel, but the image of the cages lingered. They had become too powerful a symbol, too deeply tied to fear, to vanish with a single decree. Even empty, they reminded people of the horrors once carried by the tide. In cities like Deventer and Groningen, some cages were left as permanent warnings. Rusted iron frames dangled above bridges, no longer filled with victims, but still serving as mute reminders. The creak of their chains in the wind carried ghostly whispers of drowned voices. Travelers wrote of their unease when passing beneath them. Even without bodies, the cages seemed haunted. Locals claimed they could hear splashing in the water below, as though unseen prisoners still gasped for air. Fishermen avoided casting nets near such places, fearing what they might pull up. The memory of the drowning cages seeped into folklore. Children were told cautionary tales. If they disobeyed their parents or strayed from the church, the river would rise to claim them as it had claimed so many others. Parents used the cages as a tool of discipline long after their official use had waned. Stories spread of rebels who cursed their captors before drowning, swearing vengeance upon the city. Some swore that storms which damaged canals or flooded towns were the work of drowned spirits. The water itself, once seen as a giver of life, became feared as a messenger of wrath. Yet not all who remembered the cages spoke of fear. Some told of courage. Martyrs of the Reformation were honored in secret songs and whispered tales, their suffering transformed into proof of unbreakable faith. These drowned rebels were remembered not as criminals, but as heroes swallowed by tyranny. The dual memory, fear and reverence, shaped how the Dutch viewed authority. The cages showed how far rulers could go to control a people, but they also showed how suffering could plant seeds of resistance. In this way, iron and water shaped both obedience and rebellion. The slow death of drowning was itself a mirror of political struggle. Like the tide, oppression rose inch by inch, and only the strongest could hold their heads above it. The cages became metaphors for an entire era, a nation suspended between survival and suffocation. Even foreign visitors wrote about the practice. Merchants from England, Spain, and the German states described their horror at the cages, comparing them to the Spanish donkey or the Iron Crown. To them, the drowning cages revealed a uniquely Dutch cruelty, forged by the land's endless battle with water. Artists too began to capture the cages in woodcuts and sketches. Though often censored, these images circulated secretly, showing gaunt figures trapped above rivers. For some, they served as warnings. For others, they became symbols of defiance against tyranny. By the 18th century, the drowning cages had fallen out of practical use. Enlightenment thought, shifting politics, and changes in justice slowly eroded the will to employ such punishments. Yet the iron still hung in places, rusting above canals, relics that no one dared remove. Some said it was bad luck to dismantle a cage. Workers feared that disturbing the rusted frames would awaken the spirits of the drowned. Others insisted the cages must remain, to remind future generations of the price of rebellion. And so, they stayed, swaying silently above the water. As years passed, the rivers washed away the blood and the bones, but the memory never fully disappeared. Travelers recorded local guides pointing to old cages, telling stories of heretics, rebels, and martyrs who had once gasped for breath within. Each cage became a monument to both cruelty and defiance. The symbolism outlived the practice. In poetry and balladry, the cages stood for oppression, the river for inevitable fate, and the prisoner for the struggle of conscience. Writers used these images to speak of freedom without naming it directly, keeping rebellion alive through metaphor. In rural villages, elders spoke of the cages as if they were alive. They said iron remembers. They said the water never forgets. Children shuddered at bedtime stories where figures in cages floated back from the river's depths, dripping and skeletal, demanding to know why no one helped them. The fear even shaped behavior on the water. Boatmen grew quiet when passing old cages, as though conversation itself would disturb the restless dead. Silence was a form of respect, or perhaps a shield, against the memory of what the tide had once claimed. Eventually, rust and time broke many of the cages, dropping them into the rivers below. Divers centuries later recovered twisted iron frames, encrusted with barnacles and mud. These relics, once instruments of terror, were hauled up and displayed in museums. Frozen pieces of cruelty turned into artifacts,